No one noticed that Kevin was missing until Monday morning. He was reliable, always checked in. So when Kevin's supervisor at Great Smoky Mountains National Park realized he hadn't heard from him since Saturday, it set off quiet alarm bells. Kevin was seasoned trail crew, used to being alone for days, but his truck sat empty at Caldwell Fork Trailhead, doors unlocked, his lunch still sitting half-eaten in the passenger seat. Something wasn't right. By the time the park rangers began quietly organizing a search, Jason Briggs was already on his way. Jason wasn't supposed to be involved. He wasn't a ranger. He wasn't SAR certified. He was Kevin's cousin. Desk job, city life, the last person you'd expect to go hiking alone into the backcountry. But when he got the call from Kevin's sister and heard about the truck, the silence, the map left open in the glove box, something inside him wouldn't let go. He packed a bag before the call ended and drove up from Knoxville that same night, slept in his car at the ranger station, woke up before dawn. By 6 a.m., he was halfway down the same trail Kevin had taken. Didn't tell anyone he was going in. Didn't want to be told to wait. The woods seemed harmless enough at first. Quiet, misty. He walked cautiously, not wanting to miss anything important. But as he moved deeper, the trail became harder to follow. Fog rolled in heavy, muting sounds and washing out colors, turning everything into shades of gray. After an hour, the forest started changing. Jason couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but something felt wrong. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no leaves rustling, just his breathing and the sound of his footsteps. Then he saw something move. He stopped cold, staring through the fog toward a cluster of trees. It had looked like a person stepping behind a thick oak trunk. Jason squinted, waited, but nothing moved again. "Kevin?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and muffled in the fog. Nothing answered. He told himself he was imagining it and kept walking. But now his pulse was elevated, eyes scanning the trees constantly. Every shadow looked like it hid something, someone. A few minutes later, Jason heard a soft click, a sound like a stone tapping against another. 4 quick taps, deliberate and even. It repeated itself once, then stopped. Jason stood frozen, trying to locate it, but the sound had no clear source. It seemed to come from everywhere. He kept walking, his pace quickening, the silence now oppressive. Suddenly, off to his right, movement caught his eye again. A pale flash, quick and low. This time he caught a clearer glimpse. Something crouched low behind the trees, quickly pulling back out of sight. Too big for a deer, too odd-shaped for a bear. His heart started pounding harder. He paused, stared into the woods, and shouted again, "Kev!" No reply. Just that heavy, unnatural quiet. Then a whistle, 2 sharp notes, familiar. The signal he and Kevin had used since childhood, calling to each other in crowded places. His heart leaped. "Kevin!" Jason shouted, moving toward the sound. But when he rounded a bend, the trail was empty. No Kevin. No one. Instead, on a low branch hung Kevin's jacket. Jason stepped forward quickly, but something stopped him mid-step. It wasn't fabric at all. It was strips of bark, peeling and twisted to look exactly like Kevin's green trail jacket. It had been carefully arranged, almost like bait. Jason felt a chill race down his spine. From behind him came the tapping sound again. Click, 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 click. Perfect rhythm. He spun around, searching. Nothing. Jason backed away, his breathing shallow, quickening. He pushed on down the trail, anxious now, checking over his shoulder every few steps. His mind raced with possible explanations, none of them comforting. The trail twisted downward into a thickly wooded ravine, and again he saw movement. This time he froze, staring openly. A figure stood deep among the trees, tall, thin, and utterly still. Just a silhouette in the gray mist. Jason could barely breathe. His pulse hammered in his temples. "Kevin?" he whispered, knowing already that it wasn't him. The figure shifted oddly, stiff and slow, then vanished behind a tree, not stepping but sliding sideways like a puppet pulled out of view. Jason began to move faster. Something deep inside told him not to stop again. He descended quickly, nearly jogging now, stumbling down the trail as it curved sharply left. Suddenly, directly in front of him stood another figure. It was Kevin, real this time, unmistakably him, frozen, staring vacantly off the side of the trail. Jason rushed forward. "Kev?" he said urgently, grabbing his cousin's arm. Kevin didn't react at first. His eyes were distant, unfocused, his face pale and damp, lips cracked from dehydration. Jason gave him water, waited patiently. After several moments, Kevin blinked slowly, finally meeting Jason's eyes. "Jason?" Kevin whispered. His voice was hollow, uncertain. "It's me. I'm here," Jason said. "Are you hurt?" Kevin slowly shook his head. "They followed me," Kevin murmured, his voice barely audible. "Who?" Jason asked, trying not to let panic show in his voice. Kevin's eyes widened slightly, looking past Jason into the woods. "They're watching us now," he whispered. "They pretend to be people, but they can't get it right." Jason felt cold sweat run down his back. Kevin continued, his voice trembling slightly. "They try your voice. They copy your movements, but they don't breathe right. They don't walk right." Jason glanced around quickly. "We have to go. Can you walk?" Kevin nodded slowly, eyes still unfocused. The journey back felt longer. Kevin moved stiffly, often pausing to stare into the trees. At one point, he stopped abruptly, grabbing Jason's arm. "It looked just like you," Kevin said, voice shaking. "It whistled your signal, Jason. I almost went to it, but it had no face, just eyes. Eyes, but nothing else." Jason's stomach churned. He pulled Kevin forward again, urging him gently. The fog began lifting as they reached the trailhead. Kevin relaxed slightly, breathing easier. Jason felt relief wash over him as their cars came into view. He turned one last time toward the woods and froze. Standing at the edge of the fog, just visible between the trees, was another figure. Tall, too tall, oddly angled, standing completely motionless, watching. Kevin saw it too. His hand tightened on Jason's shoulder. "Don't look at it," Kevin whispered fiercely. Jason turned away, his heart thundering. They drove straight to the ranger station, reported finding Kevin alive, confused, but physically okay. The rangers chalked it up to dehydration and fatigue. Kevin stayed quiet about the figures, the whistling. He agreed politely when the rangers advised more caution next time. But Jason knew something had changed in Kevin. Days later, back in Knoxville, Jason still jumped at small sounds. He caught himself constantly glancing out windows, checking dark corners of parking lots. And Kevin wasn't the same. He stayed withdrawn, often staring silently into space. He never spoke about what happened, but Jason could feel it lingering. Then one night, Jason pulled into his driveway late from work. Sitting for a moment in the silence, he heard it again. A whistle. 2 notes, sharp and clear, from the trees behind his house. He sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel, heart racing. He didn't turn to look. He knew it wasn't Kevin. I've been on the road in North Dakota for weeks now, researching bits and pieces of local folklore that I've been collecting for an independent project I've been working on. It started out in Minot, where I had initially planned to do a quick pass through the state, mostly focusing on old pioneer legends, and maybe a few ghost stories I'd heard were tied to some of the old homestead sites. But that shifted drastically when someone at the local historical society up there, after I'd casually mentioned I was heading east, pulled me aside and said there had been hushed chatter of a Wendigo sighting around the region of Devil's Lake. They warned me, unprompted. I hadn't even brought up anything remotely about cryptids. To be very careful traveling alone after dark around dens and wooded areas near the Spirit Lake Reservation. That was the first warning I got, but not the last. I decided to drive out toward Fort Totten State Historic Site. It's one of those spots I'd always wanted to see anyway, but on the drive, my mind kept circling back to the Wendigo rumor. Honestly, I was skeptical. I'm used to hearing about Wendigo legends more commonly shared by the Ojibwe or Cree communities in Minnesota or Canada. Still, I knew this region had the same sort of cultural ties. But as soon as I arrived, I found the atmosphere strangely subdued, not in a ghostly sense, but like people were wary of saying too much in front of an outsider. I ended up in a small diner-like place in the area. It's not an official diner in the capital D sense, but they had burgers and coffee, and folks were stopping in for lunch. While I sat there, eavesdropping a bit, I heard a couple of the older locals mentioning that there was something prowling around the outskirts at night, something that might be connected to old stories their grandparents used to warn them about. One of them basically said they wouldn't even name the creature. They didn't want to draw it in, was the phrase that struck me. And I'm not exaggerating when I say both of them lowered their voices significantly when they realized I was listening. It reminded me of times I've heard about name avoidance in other traditions, like they genuinely believed if they spoke the word Wendigo out loud, it might cause it to manifest or notice them. I tried to approach them respectfully, told them I was a traveling researcher interested in local folklore, but they seemed reluctant to share details, so I left the conversation alone. Later that evening, I was setting up my notes in a little roadside motel off ND 20, not far from the southern edge of the lake, flipping through old clippings and reference books. I kept telling myself it was just local superstition, but the further I went through some of these accounts, some from the early 1900s, with references to sightings in the lake region, the more I started to get chills. This one story from 1920-something absolutely rattled me, talking about a man who wandered into a small town just west of Devil's Lake, famished, delirious, and ranting in broken attempts at English and a local native dialect. The story suggests people believed he was possessed by a Wendigo, or something akin to it, because of how he reacted to certain spiritual rites. No one seemed to know what happened to the poor man after that. The newspaper clip just ended with a mention of him being turned over to some local authority who wanted to keep things quiet. A day later, I decided to see if I could gather more info directly from anybody who might have stories on the reservation. I was cautious. Folklore is delicate, and I'm well aware I'm an outsider. But again, I got the repeated warnings not to linger at night, especially near wooded areas. I was told indirectly that there was an elder who insists something is hunting around Big Coulee or near the Cheyenne River sometime after midnight. They said it wasn't safe even for those who knew the land, let alone drifters like me. There was no direct talk of an actual sighting, but an older fellow indicated that he heard from his cousin about something pale, emaciated, and disturbingly tall, rummaging through the outskirts of a friend's property. But every single person kept their voice low, like they were telling me they didn't want this to get out, or maybe they didn't want the attention it would bring, or the misfortune. What gets me is that I've always been so drawn to the collective fear these legends can inspire, like the community hush around certain topics. Wendigo beliefs revolve so heavily around themes of cannibalism and greed, but there's also that notion of the winter demon hunting you when you've strayed too far. And I wasn't sure if the modern sightings were just a retelling of old cautionary tales, or if there was something truly lurking in the forests by the water. I'm the type who tries to keep an open mind but maintain healthy skepticism too. Because I'm prone to tangents, I did some further digging in the local library in Devil's Lake, scanning microfilm for any mention of unexplained sightings or weird missing persons cases. That's how I got lost in some old records about an influenza outbreak in the early 20th century. It had nothing to do with Wendigos at first glance, but I found that entire families would hole up in these small cabins during harsh winters. Several accounts mention that certain families would just vanish, and it was always chalked up to them succumbing to the elements or disease, but reading between the lines hinted at something else. A local writer at the time apparently tried connecting those vanishings to some evil spirit, but the rest of the article was lost to damaged microfilm. It's maddening. I wish I had more time to piece this puzzle together properly. Last night I made a quick run out along the roads near the lake looking for vantage points to observe the area, just out of curiosity. I stayed in my car, mind you, because I'm not in the habit of prowling around by myself in total darkness, especially with so many warnings in my ear. For a moment or two, I thought I saw an oddly shaped silhouette near a line of trees, but it was almost certainly just a trick of the light or an animal, because after I refocused my eyes, it was gone. Still, you know how sometimes your body seizes up with that deep, primal fear? That's what I felt in that moment, and it took me a minute to calm down. I told myself it was just nerves. I remember reading once that Wendigos are sometimes described as giant, lanky figures with hollow eyes, ribs protruding, sometimes missing lips, or with an unnaturally elongated mouth. The local version around here might differ. A few folks implied it's more of a shape-shifting presence, a hungry spirit that can inhabit a person under dire circumstances. But they rarely want to say more than that. It's like discussing it in detail is taboo. The warnings were all the same, though. If it's around, store your food carefully, keep your distance, don't let it smell your fear. And that's basically how they put it, like it was a living predator, not just a spirit. I've heard a number of cryptid stories in my time, but this one grabs hold of you in a different way. I know you prefer accounts that are more straightforward for your channel, but I can't help sharing all these odd twists and turns because that's exactly how it came to me. Bits and pieces from multiple sources, all culminating in an intense sense of dread that's really hard to shake. I keep telling myself I'll move on to a different part of the country soon, but there's this nagging feeling that I shouldn't leave until I gather more interviews or maybe track down that elder. On the other hand, it's possible I'm poking at something best left alone. The weird part is, the people here don't seem to treat it as sensationalized or purely mythical. It's more like a grim acceptance, a cautionary tale that's possibly happening in real time. In places like Grand Forks or Fargo, you mention Wendigo, and folks assume you're joking around about some Halloween creature. But the ones close to the lake, they look at you with a grave understanding, and then just shake their heads, as if to say, don't go looking for it. I don't think I've ever put this memory in writing before, but it's something I've revisited in my mind for decades now. I served 22 years in the Navy, retiring as a chief petty officer, mostly stationed on carriers. My last duty station was aboard the USS Nimitz, which is where this event happened in the summer of 1991, just off the coast of the Arabian Sea. We were on routine deployment following Operation Desert Storm, and those night watches could get downright dull until they weren't. I was part of a small maintenance crew assigned to check electrical systems in some of the lower decks. The Nimitz is huge, bigger than people realize, 7, 8, sometimes 9 levels below the flight deck, with labyrinthine corridors that can lead you into weird corners if you're not careful. On this particular night, I recall it was around 0300, and the hush of the ship was punctuated by the distant drone of the engines. I was alone, heading to a compartment we'd nicknamed the Catacombs, because it was a rarely visited section in the forward part of the ship. It was dingy with sporadic lighting and smelled of old hydraulic fluid. We didn't need to be there often, but the circuit boards for certain comm systems ran along that route. I remember holding my flashlight low, near my legs, mostly out of habit. A lot of guys do that to preserve night vision. The corridor felt oddly empty, even for overnight. I paused to check an access panel and realized I was hearing something like a faint scraping sound, almost like claws on metal, though claws is a word I didn't think of right away. The normal hum of machinery was there, but under it, something was off. I almost dismissed it as random background noise, maybe a loose piece of metal. But then I rounded a corner, and that's when I saw it. I say it because my brain didn't have any immediate category to drop this figure into. It was around the bend, partially hidden by the piping. I saw what looked like a reptilian face, not a mask, not a reflection, but an actual scaly visage with angled, slit-like eyes, a dull greenish-brown color. It was watching me. The strangest thing is how deliberate and calm its gaze was, almost like it was sizing me up. I'm not a tall man, only about 5'9", and this thing appeared a bit taller, though it was crouched, so it was hard to be sure. The corridor lighting was abysmal, just the scattered overheads and my small flashlight, but the shape of its head and those ridges around what would be ears stood out clearly. I froze, and after that initial shock, I flicked my flashlight up to get a better look. I remember the beam shaking because my hand was trembling. For a split second, I noticed what looked like a faint sheen on its skin, kind of like you'd see on a lizard. But then it slunk back behind the piping. I just stood there, not sure if I'd completely lost my mind. I was wide awake, no medication in my system, no fatigue beyond the usual. I thought about radioing security, but would I say, I saw a huge lizard man? I just called out quietly like, anyone there? I don't even remember the exact words, but it was not a full yelling tone, more of a desperate hush. No response, just that engine rumble and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It wasn't until I took a few steps forward that I realized how disoriented I felt. Part of me was urging to run, but curiosity, or maybe confusion, was pushing me ahead. I peered behind that piping, but it was a dead end behind a bundle of cables. Nothing there except the stale heat. No place to hide, but also no sign of whoever or whatever I'd seen. It was as if it had vanished into the wall. I've heard from other guys that there are crawl spaces or maintenance shafts that are rarely used, so maybe it got in there somehow. Even so, the speed and silence with which it moved was eerie. Over the next few days, I was on edge. The very next night, I was more alert walking the passages, pausing to peer around corners. It was at a time of heightened security in general, because we were just leaving the Persian Gulf area, and I had half a mind that I'd run into some stowaway or saboteur. But the scaly aspect? I couldn't reconcile that with anything human. I caught mention from another sailor about strange sightings in the lower decks, purely in passing. He said he'd heard weird rumors since the 80s, something about reptilian-like figures, but he wasn't speaking to me directly, more like I overheard him telling a new recruit that crazy stories pop up on every ship. I never confronted that sailor about it. I started to wonder if I was just frightened by shadows, but I kept circling back to those eyes. They were so full of intelligence, not like some random creature scuttling around. And the shape, that kind of broad, flat snout shape, is not something I can chalk up to a trick of the light. Over the years, I've questioned everything. My stateside buddies once joked I needed to put it behind me, but I've always had trouble with that. It's the kind of memory that haunts you because it doesn't fit your worldview. I've been in some hairy situations, combat zones, night landings on the carrier deck, rough seas, but none of those left me this unsettled. You might think the Navy would have logs or cameras, but we didn't exactly have cameras covering those obscure corners, and logs wouldn't say, "Scaly intruder spotted." At one point, a master-at-arms asked me casually if I'd seen anything strange. We were discussing random watch reports, and he joked about sea serpents. Maybe he was fishing for information, or maybe he heard I looked spooked the night before. I guess that was my opportunity to say something, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I just acted like I didn't know what he was talking about. I still wonder if there was an internal rumor mill about sightings. Some folks believe in secret experiments, or that the Navy has dealings with all kinds of advanced technology. During my career, I heard wild rumors, flying objects out over the Pacific that would whip around faster than anything we had in our arsenal. Then there were always whispers about underwater submersibles with bizarre shapes. I typically shrugged off that sort of thing. But after that night, I started to question what might be going on behind the scenes. You don't serve on a big carrier without suspecting there's more going on than they tell you. Still, a reptilian figure lurking below decks is about as X-Files as it gets. I sometimes netted myself in the rack at night and thought about going down there again alone. Curiosity kept poking at me, but my fear, or maybe my sense of self-preservation, won out. I never had another direct encounter, though I swear I heard those scraping noises a few more times on watch. But each time I went to investigate, I came up empty. It felt like chasing ghosts, except I knew what I saw wasn't a ghost. It was something physical, something that shouldn't be there. In my final months before retirement, I asked a couple of old-timers if they'd ever witnessed anything unusual. Most just gave me typical sea stories, UFOs at night or weird sonar readings, nothing specifically about reptilians. A retired bosun's mate once said he heard about an alligator man rumor back in the 70s on a different carrier. He never saw it himself, so he dismissed it as a tall tale. But hearing that was enough to cement in my mind that there might be more to these sightings than just one lone instance. I finished my career with commendations for good service. Never had a single disciplinary mark. Never took medication that might cause hallucinations. And yet here I am, decades later, recounting how I held a flashlight to the face of something reptilian in the lower decks of one of our most formidable warships. Maybe it's easier to talk about it now because nobody can pull rank on me for sounding crazy. Or maybe it's because I've come to terms with the fact that our world is bigger and stranger than we dare admit. I doubt the Navy would ever acknowledge it officially. They'd chalk it up to exhaustion or illusions caused by flickering lights. But I know what I saw. That face is etched in my memory as clearly as the day I was given my anchors. There are things that roam in the shadows of even the most secure vessels, and sometimes we catch a glimpse. I can't explain it. I only know it happened. And that's why I wanted to reach out to you. Maybe you've heard something similar, or at least might be open to the possibility that not all is as it seems in those underbelly corridors. I was in Minneapolis for a speaking engagement at the Downtown Convention Center last month, February 2023. I believe it was the second weekend, because I remember the Valentine's Day decorations were hanging in the lobby of the hotel. I'm not from Minnesota originally, so I try to immerse myself in local spots whenever I'm in town. This time around, I decided to head to Lake Harriet before dawn since I'd heard it was a nice place to clear my head. I've done this in tons of cities, find a lake or a park or some little getaway, ever since I took on this whole traveling motivational speaker thing. Helps me gather my thoughts. Anyway, I got up ridiculous early. I think I woke up about 4:30 or 5 a.m. The night before, I'd been at this small dinner event with a handful of local entrepreneurs, so I hadn't really crashed until maybe midnight. Usually, I'd consider that too short a sleep, but I had so many ideas swirling around in my head about my next keynote that I just decided I'd rather get up, have a quick coffee in the lobby, which tasted burnt, by the way. The packet stuff always does at these basic roadside hotels, then drive over to Lake Harriet. The roads were fairly drivable despite a dusting of fresh snow from the day before. I parked near the bandshell area. I recall there was a sign about a concert series, but obviously nothing was happening that time of year. It was still dark, not pitch black, but that pre-dawn gloom where you can make out shapes around you if your eyes adjust. The temperature was maybe 4 or 5 degrees above zero, so I was bundled up in thick gloves, a parka, the works. As I walked toward the lake, I realized it was completely frozen over, which makes sense for mid-February in Minnesota. There were a couple of ice fishermen tents out there, probably from the day before, because I didn't see any lights inside them. Maybe they were left behind or someone was planning on coming back later to fish. I took a minute to notice how quiet everything was. No wind, no voices, barely any traffic noise in the distance. I started walking a path along the perimeter, thinking about my upcoming talk and what angle I was going to take. This is where things got strange. I'd say it was maybe 5:45 a.m., because I glanced at my phone once to see if I had any messages from a client about that day's schedule. I was near some trees, close to the shore, but could still see almost the entire expanse of the frozen lake in front of me. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. And I mean really moved, like it was sprinting at an insane speed across the ice. At first, I couldn't even properly register what I was seeing, because you know how your mind tries to guess. Maybe it's a deer or a large dog or a person on a morning run, though that'd be nuts on the ice. As I focused, I realized that whatever this was, it was definitely upright and humanoid. But it wasn't wearing any visible layers or winter clothing, which immediately made me uneasy. Who in their right mind would be out there in that cold with no jacket? Then I noticed its gait, a kind of loping stride that didn't look natural, like the knees were bending at an odd angle or the arms were longer than they should be. It was too far away to see a face, but the figure looked pale or at least lighter colored than you'd expect from a person. And the speed. I've seen sprinters at track meets, and I swear this blew them out of the water. It covered a huge expanse of the lake in maybe 10 or 15 seconds, like it was nothing. I was absolutely rooted in place. Part of me wanted to shout or wave my arms around, but another part was like, no way am I drawing attention to myself. I wasn't sure if it could see me from that far. I was half hoping it was some bizarre trick of the light or my lack of proper sleep, but I know I wasn't hallucinating. If this had been an actual person, they would have been wearing reflective gear or big boots, or at least holding themselves differently in that frigid weather. I even caught a glimpse of its arms swinging almost out of sync with its stride. It was just off. Then it slowed right near one of those abandoned fishing tents. Didn't stop, just sort of slowed. I was maybe 100 yards from that spot in a diagonal line, so definitely too far to see exact details, but I got a sense of its proportions. Slender torso, elongated limbs. It lurched forward again, and I kid you not, it dropped to all fours for a second or two before standing back up. The hair on the back of my neck went straight up like never before. I told someone later. Indirectly, I tried to describe it as the creepiest posture I'd ever seen. That complete unpredictability of movement got to me more than anything else. After that, it sprinted again toward the far shoreline, away from me, and then it just vanished into the tree line or around the bend of the lake. I must have stood there trying to make sense of it for what felt like ages. My toes got numb from standing still. Part of me was panicking, thinking, what did I just witness? Another part was already trying to rationalize it. Maybe a cross-country skier without poles? But that's impossible. They'd have skis. Maybe a coyote with mange? No, it was too tall when upright. I can't pinpoint it. All I know is it was nothing I've ever encountered before. When I finally snapped out of it, I headed straight back to my rental car. I nearly slipped on a patch of ice because I was walking so fast. I remember fumbling with my car keys and dropping them, which is classic me when I'm jittery, then hastily locking all the doors once I got inside, like that would do any good against whatever that thing was if it decided to come after me. I sat there with the engine running and the heater blasting for a few minutes. I was actually shaking, and not just from being cold. That entire day, my keynote presentation was a blur. People told me I did fine, but I felt a little out of my body, honestly. I found myself randomly looking out the window of the convention center, imagining this pale humanoid creeping around the city. I didn't bring it up with any of my colleagues. Let's be honest. It's the kind of thing that makes you sound either paranoid or completely off your rocker. Still, I couldn't shake this potent sense of dread mixed with awe at what I'd seen. By the evening, I was on autopilot, did my networking and returned to the hotel. Slept like a rock out of sheer mental exhaustion.